Hello. Sorry for the delay. When we started this class, we had to do it the day before Mercury retrograde, so I was curious how that would impact the class, if there would be snafus during the class. Anyway, this wasn't too bad, I hope. All right. The reason I put this image up on the screen is like the opening screensaver. It's one of these unusual, weird, surrealistic, mystical pieces of artwork by a Dutch artist named Joffre, Johfra, I believe, now deceased. And by the end of the class, hopefully you're going to have some idea what this bizarre image means. It's quite striking, as you can tell, and it touches on what we're going to be dealing with tonight, which is the microcosm and the macrocosm. Last week I was, as I referred to it, setting the table, talking about kind of the big picture. And this week we're doing some of that too. We're kind of going into some of the bigger mystical ideas. And next week we start in on some of the practical techniques, some of the more mystical and some occult techniques. And by occult I really mean meditation sorts of things that work with the mind. And but what we talked about last week, we talked about this cosmological vision that that I've learned from my teachers in the Kriya Yoga tradition. I also talked about the fact that I had studied with a Zen teacher, and he was more a straight mystic, not so much into the metaphysics or the occultism. And we'll get to some of his stuff, in the next few weeks, which is very subtle and very profound, I think. But, if I had to summarize what I said last week, I came across this marvelous quote of Schopenhauer that I actually got from Joseph Campbell during one of his workshops years ago. He had translated this manuscript of Schopenhauer. I think the title was On the Apparent Intentionality and the Fate of the Individual. And this quote struck me from the start because I had just started work on the waking dream. And this book summarized so much of what I had learned in the esoteric yogic tradition and what I was kind of coming to believe on my own. The world is a vast dream, dreamed by a single being, but in such a way that all the dream characters dream too. Hence, everything interlocks and harmonizes with everything else. A vast world event conforms to the destiny requirements of many thousands, befitting each in his own way. So what I said last week, I talked about this notion of, God, of the One, of Brahma, whatever name you want to give it. And we haven't gone into any of the subtleties about that because, I'm being very general at this point. But I talked about creation as a kind of a dream. The term that Shelley Trimmer and Yogananda used was cosmic dream, and that we entered into this dream. We weren't created by God, the One, Brahma. We entered into it. We're a self-existent one. That God is a brother or sister, not a father figure. We have the same capacities. The idea in the key principle of esotericism, if there is one, is the idea that you are gods, that you are a god. And it's a heretical notion, of course, in fundamentalist circles. And it's one of the differences in the way we looked at the Garden of Eden story, that the kind of fundamentalist view of it is this notion that you were created by God, and that in the Bible there's that passage about Adam and Eve, or if they eat of the apple, they become like us, and it's this threat. Whereas in the Gnostic interpretation of the Garden of Eden, it's not a threat, it's our birthright, so to speak, and it's a process of waking up, and it's almost as though this garden was set up as a kind of a training ground for gods, so to speak. But the key point that I really was trying to get at through there, one of the key points I was trying to get at with that discussion, was this idea that we are in fact individuals. It's the Samkhya view in the Hindu school of philosophy that we're individual Atmans, that we're not all just one person behind this drama, as the Vedantics say. And again, I'm not asking, I said this last week, I'll repeat it this week, I'm not asking you to believe that, I'm simply putting that out there as an alternative to the mythologies that we've mainly been raised in. Even many of those in the yogic school adhere so firmly to the Vedantic view of non-dualism that this is even heretical to some of them. And it's certainly heretical to some of those in the Buddhist tradition. And again, we're generalizing. In the same way that the Hindu tradition is not monolithic, I think it's a mistake. I've known enough Buddhists, and I've studied with different Buddhist teachers in Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, etc., that I know that it's not monolithic either. You know, Mahayana Buddhism is quite different from Hinayana Buddhism, for example. But be that as it may, this notion of individualism, the idea that we are individuals, we're self-existent ones, we're like these Atmanic flames, so to speak. One of the terms that has been used is monads. It's a term that Leibniz used, the philosopher Leibniz, a contemporary of Isaac Newton. And there is something unique about this. And this is where we start getting into, well, I don't want to jump the gun here, but it gets into an idea of the microcosm. This fundamental idea that you find not just in Buddhism and not just in Hinduism, you find it in Western philosophers like Friedrich Schelling, you find it in Leibniz, you find it in Paracelsus, you find it in the Hermetic schools, and so on and so forth. And another way to summarize this, I suppose, is as without, so within. We're not simply these enclosed billiard balls in space, so to speak. There's this interconnection between the inside and the outside. And it's the type of connection that it's a reflection. In other words, there is this integrated sort of reflectivity between the inner and the outer. There's a quote here, I believe, that I have next of, well, we'll get to that in a second. What you do is what the whole universe is doing at the place you call here and now. It's a very profound quote by Alan Watts. I'm going to repeat that. What you do, what you're doing right now, what you do in your life, is what the whole universe is actually doing at the place you call here and now. You are the whole universe expressed into this point of time and space. And it's one of the fundamental mystical ideas. Now let's go back to the image there. One of the most elegant models for expressing this idea that you find in the Eastern schools is called Indra's net. It's sometimes Indra's net of pearls, Indra's net of gems, Indra's net of I forget the other one there, but it's pearls, gems, I think it's gems. But the point is that each of these pearls, as you see in this image, let me put the arrow on here, you take a given pearl and every pearl reflects every other pearl, or every gem reflects every other gem in that net. So there is this unique interpenetrable sort of quality about it that it really started, Indra's net goes back to Hindu philosophy, but it actually then was appropriated by Buddhism, by the Mahayana school, and then by Huayen, Huayen, I believe it's spelled, Buddhism, because it so beautifully expresses this idea of interconnectedness. These aren't simply, imagine these were lead ball bearings in a net. There'd be none of that connectedness. And many of us have heard of this idea in recent years through the concept of the holographic principle, the holographic paradigm, which expresses essentially the same idea. As the theory goes, you take a holographic image and you break it up into many small pieces. And unlike a regular, let's say, printed photograph, you cut up an individual photograph, let's say on a piece of printing paper, and each image that you get is separate. But you cut up a holographic image, and each part contains the whole. And that is, in a sense, the notion of the microcosm. And by the way, the notion of the microcosm has many different applications. Anything can become a microcosm, so to speak. Like when you do a divinatory act like the I Ching, that's a microcosm of the larger moment in time. In astrology, the moment of birth is a microcosm of the whole life. In traditional schools of thought, the leader of a country is the microcosm of the whole destiny of the nation, and so on and so forth. You find this, but the key way that we're talking about it here, and the main way that it's been used, is the notion that each person is a microcosm. And that, I think, also nicely conveys that idea that I couldn't quite get to last week. We didn't have time, but this idea of dualism is a dirty word. But this isn't really dualism in a strict sense, because you have this interconnectedness. Every part is enmeshed with every other part. So it's not a strict dualism as though you have these firm boundaries between things. And I think that we'll get to this in a later class having to do with the nature of self-viewing itself and the one that is eternally acting as a two in this sort of esoteric idea. I remember when I was at the Zen monastery. When I first arrived, Dido, the teacher, remarked how he was reading Ken Wilber's book, Holographic Paradigm. And he hadn't made it all the way through. I had just read the book, so I knew the whole book. And I knew that Wilber didn't buy the holographic paradigm principle. He felt that it was like a low-level, poor man's notion of unity. And I felt he really didn't understand it, to be honest. I have huge respect for Wilber, but I don't think, to be very honest, I just don't think he has a symbolic, archetypal mindset for certain ideas. And Dido had just read the book, and he said openly to me that he felt that the notion of the holographic principle, which, like you see here, very similar to Indra's net, conveys a very profound truth about the meditative experience in terms of when you get to a certain realization of the interconnectedness of everything. Not one, not two is the way that some the texts talk about it. And so, we're looking at the world. There's this inner universe here. And we think that there is an outer universe out there. In fact, they're both us. And when I read that closing poem of Shelley's last week, when he referred to the Kabbalistic phrase, countenance beheld countenance, or countenance beheld not countenance, what does that mean? Countenance is consciousness viewing itself, like you're doing right now. You're looking at a computer screen. You think that that's outside of you, or at least maybe most of you do. Maybe all of you do. I don't know. But you're looking at the world. You see it as something outside of yourself right now. I see it as something outside of myself. In fact, I'm looking at myself. It's a false boundary that I've set up that leads me to think that that's something out there that is not me. And that's countenance beholds countenance and knows not that it's beholding countenance. It's a very profound Kabbalistic idea. So there's some real world implications of this in terms of the events in our lives, the circumstances you find yourself enmeshed in life are a reflection of you in the sense of you've navigated into that part of the world, into that part of God's dream, so to speak, that befits your inner temperament, or maybe we should say karma, because you have to be careful not to judge this as good or bad as far as, let's say you've got a tragedy outside of you. That's, there's very subtle ways of understanding these things, which we're going to get into either at the end of this class or one of the next few classes, karmic cycles and ebb and flow and all this. But your world reflects you. There's a quote here that I believe I have after the Watts quote. Yes, here it is. Another quote by Schopenhauer that I got from Campbell. Is a complete misadjustment possible between the character and the fate of an individual? Or is every destiny on the whole appropriate to the character that bears it? Excuse me 1 second. So the point is that you really do. Well, I had an interview with Chogyam Trungpa, who's a Tibetan teacher back in the early 80s. And he made a comment. I was pressing him about this idea in Buddhism and trying to tough it out with him in terms of understanding his understanding of it. And he was talking about how the value of this idea is there's always a teaching, in the sense of you always have your life. Even if you don't have books or libraries or teachers, you always have your life. That's always a teaching, so to speak, about yourself. Not in a judgmental way, but just in terms of understanding things about yourself. And needless to say, this is the whole essence of astrology, in the sense of astrology is based on this idea of the microcosm, that you are indeed a reflection of the cosmos, a reflection of the universe, and that the position of the planets and the stars at the moment you were born reflect who you are. You've navigated into the solar system at the time that is most appropriate to your karmas, your most appropriate to your purpose and your destiny. You know, it's astrology isn't just about the past; it's also about the future, the seed potentials, and everybody has. Well, let's go on to the next image here. Okay, there's a quote I have here. At least there's a Christian philosopher, I think from the 3rd century A.D., Origen, Origen, and he says, "Understand that thou art another world in little, and hast within thee the sun and the moon and also the stars." You have the solar system inside of you. You have an inner sun, a Mercury, a Venus, a Mars, an Earth. You're on the Earth, which shows where we are in that system. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. This doesn't show Pluto. And this can be broken down in terms of a very specific sort of philosophy of the inner solar system, and I've talked about this before in other classes, and I'm going to get back to it a little bit in a later class because it's quite important in terms of understanding meditation. But this is the conventional understanding of the chakras. Let me get the arrow going here. We've got down here at the base, we've got Muladhara chakra, the root chakra that relates to Earth. Then we go to Svadhisthana, which is Jupiter in the planetary system. That's water. We got Manipura, that is the fire chakra. Anahata, that's the heart chakra, the 6-pointed star, which we're going to talk about later. Vishuddha, which is the throat, that's the mind. Adam's apple, as I referred to last week. We've got a chakra in the forehead, Ajna. In the back of the head, which this illustration does not show, we've got the Ajna chakra, a lunar counterpart to the sun that Yogananda talked about. Then we've got the 1,000-petaled lotus. Now we can relate this, the inner microcosm, so to speak. This is from the Waking Dream here. We have the bottom chakra is Saturn. And by the way, the outer 3 planets are harmonics of the lower 3 chakras, by the way. So they do fit in, but it's a little subtle how to explain that. Saturn for the root chakra, for Manipur, Jupiter for Svadhisthana, Mars for the Manipur. We got Venus for the heart chakra, Mercury for the throat chakra, the sun and the moon, sun for Ajna, moon for Chandra. There's no real planet for the 1,000-petaled lotus. Some say Neptune, but there really isn't a planet for that. It's above the system. And there's an alchemical aspect to this too, in terms of we have the metals that relate to these chakras. We have lead, we've got tin, we've got Mars, we've got copper, we've got quicksilver or mercury, and we've got gold for the sun, and we've got silver for the moon, the land of milk and honey up there in the head, the promised land, so to speak. And mercury for quicksilver, that's the quintessence. Quintessence is where that term comes from. It's the 5th point. So the alchemical changing of lead to gold relates on one level to the transmutation of consciousness from the base chakra up to the top. And so the signs are related in an extraordinary way. I'm giving a lecture here in April where I'm going to go into this a bit more. But the signs relate in a fairly extraordinary way to the traditional rulerships of the signs and the chakras, so that Capricorn and Aquarius relate to the root chakra, Jupiter relates to Sagittarius and Pisces, the Mars chakra to Scorpio, Aries. In other words, if you just spin the zodiac around so that Leo and Cancer are at the top, you've got this incredible inner zodiac. And so the microcosm takes on this importance in terms of literally an inner solar system in a certain sense. And maybe I shouldn't say literally, because we experience them internally, not as planets, hard material planets, but as states of consciousness. So Venus externally may be a planet, but inwardly it's a feeling. Okay, same with all of these. Externally, Mercury is a hard planet. Internally, it's a quality of thinking, of manas, of mind. And if anybody has any comments or questions as we're going along, I don't need to remind you that feel free to write something in if anything needs clarification or you want to ask something. Now, so there's a subtle point I want to make here, which is that there's different kinds of microcosmic reflections, you might say. In a sense, the zodiac, I mean, the planets reflect, you reflect, let me take that back, I'm sorry. You reflect the universe, but there's another sense in which these planets and your horoscope reflects you on different levels. It's not just the physical universe you embody higher levels. Can we have the drawing pad here? I want to show something on the pad for people if we can get that up. Okay, so in other words, what we saw there in that previous diagram was how the signs relate to these 6 levels. And in a sense, let's say this is the physical level down here, Saturn level. And the horoscope reflects actually your constitution on all these levels in a strange sort of way. The quality of earth, water, air, fire, for example, shows the emphasis. You live simultaneously on different levels of experience. The physical, the etheric, the lower astral, the higher astral, the mental, and then you might say the causal up here. And the horoscope, your horoscope is a microcosm. You're a microcosm. Your physical personality, your body is a microcosm of how you are on all these different levels all at once. Okay, now let's go back to the diagram that was on the slide there. You know, it's one of the points, I should probably mention this. I had a debate with Ken Wilber years ago when I worked here by letter, in which he felt astrology was a lower level system, quotes, lower level, and that it didn't really have anything to say about higher levels. And I was trying to say that it's a symbolic diagram. It's like saying you take a sheet music of Bach's, you know, St. Matthew's Passion, for example, and it might just be a set of markings on a piece of physical paper, but it relates to very profound experiences, aesthetic experiences, maybe even intellectual, on higher levels of experience. And so it's a multi-leveled holographic diagram, the horoscope, you might say. And if you know how to read the horoscope, you can actually understand how you are configured. In other words, this is an example of somebody I picked at random. This is from the Waking Dream. You take their horoscope, and this is one way of doing it. You take their horoscope, you switch it around so that Leo and Cancer are at the top, and you've got a diagram of, where's the arrow there? I'm not getting the arrow. There we go, thank you. For example, this person had 4 planets in Virgo, and so that puts a heavy emphasis on the feminine side of the Mercury chakra, the throat chakra. And they've got the moon conjuncting Jupiter in Aquarius down there at the bottom of the chart, which really shows, you know, an interesting dichotomy there. And he's got the Mars over there in Scorpio. So in other words, you start to understand, if you know how to read this, of how the horoscope, how your chart in the physical world reflects you on all these different levels. Okay, I'm going to go on here now. Yes, question. Sandy. Well, like I said, the outer planets, well, you can fit those in. You know, in this particular diagram, I didn't include the outer planets, but you can include the outer planets in this horoscope. When I did this, it was appealing to an old school astrology group that I wasn't going to use the outer planets, but you can use them. And in terms of how they relate to the chakras, like I said before, they're in a sense harmonics of the lower 3 chakras. Uranus is a harmonic energy of the Saturn root chakra. Neptune is a harmonic of the 2nd chakra, Jupiter, and Pluto is a harmonic of the 3rd chakra. Because none of these planets are pure the way Shelley talked about it. None of the planets are pure expressions of the middle channel. They're all a little bit to Ida or Pingali, which is something we'll maybe get to next week, what that means. In other words, the chart doesn't show where you are in the middle of the spine. It doesn't show where you are in Sushumna. It shows where you are in Ida or Pingali. Let me go back. I'll explain this a little bit further here. In other words, there are three channels. There is the middle channel, straight up and down the middle. Then you've got the right and left-hand channel. If I had done this a different way, I could have put all the feminine signs on one side and all the masculine signs on the other, because the energies actually swirl down through the feminine and come up to the masculine. But there are these three channels. And the right-hand channel shows your energies in the waking world. The left-hand channel shows your energies in the internal dream world. And the middle channel shows where you are in the crack between worlds, the spiritual channel. The arrow is not moving. Why is that? Let me start it over. Maybe that's, there we go. The middle channel does not relate to anything really in your life other than that state of balance between waking and sleeping, between life and death, you might say. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's a good question, Sandy. It's not an easy one to answer, but on the one hand, just to reiterate, the three planets relate to the lower three chakras. They're kind of like co-rulers, you might say, in the same way we use in astrology. And in terms of the astrological diagram, you can place them in here, and that'll show emphasis as well within the different chakra points by seeing where they fall. Now, let's move on here. Now, there's another level of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that is that in these traditional systems, each of the different parts of the body relate to different aspects of the cosmos. This is another way that it's shown. I somehow don't think this drawing was done by Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, but it does show at least how the different parts of the body relate to the signs. So the head is Aries, the throat is Taurus, the arms are Gemini, the chest is Cancer, so on. It goes on around, with the feet finally at Pisces. And so your body is a miniature cosmos in that sense. It really reflects the cosmos in some archetypal, symbolic fashion. And, well, why don't I go on to the next? And so, for example, this may not apply. If you're not an astrologer, you might not quite get this. But you can understand your relationship to that cosmos by looking to see your chart. So for instance, you might see someone that's got Saturn in Pisces. And very often you'll see they might have problems with their feet, or they might have Saturn in Virgo, or they might have Jupiter. I just did a chart, I'm being very frank here, but I just did a chart for a woman that had Jupiter in Cancer in the first house. It was quite well proportioned, if we can put it that way. You know, so that literally your body is a manifestation to some extent of your cosmos and the cosmos in which you live and how you perceive the cosmos. Now, let's go on to the next illustration, because now we're getting into the good stuff. Here's that illustration again by Joffre, the Dutch artist, the brilliant Dutch artist. He did a famous series of the Zodiac that you might have seen at some point. If you go online and look up his artwork, Johfra, he's done these beautiful images for the 12 signs of the Zodiac, amongst many others. He's got a website that's been maintained since his death. Now you look at this image and it can be very confusing. What I want to do is go through this image and explain it as best as I can, based on my own understanding as well as based on what the artist apparently himself said about it. And it's quite fascinating. I'm going to build my way up to, I think, the key factor here. But what he was trying to do with this image is syncretize a number of traditions. The name of the piece is called Unio Mystica, Unimystica, if I remember correctly. And he was trying to show as many symbols crammed into one, you might say, as possible that conveyed union, transformation, spiritual transcendence, and so on. A little bit similar in a way to the Theosophical seal, what Blavatsky came up with, which we'll get to here shortly. which is, Blavatsky was trying to put in a number of different symbols from different traditions into one symbol. And when I drove in here tonight, there's a gate, and there's this symbol over the gate that is the Theosophical symbol. And he was trying to do something similar, not the same, of course, but similar. And so it's multidisciplinary, multicultural. For example, there's elements of Hinduism and yoga, there's Buddhist elements, there's Egyptian factors, there's Christian, there's Neoplatonic, there's Hermetic, there's Kabbalistic, there's Greek, there's Pythagorean, there's astrological. So let's go through and look at some of these to begin with. For example, there's a mythological symbolism here, and this is the world tree, the tree of life, you might say, that you find in many different traditions that mythologists like Mircea Eliade have written about. And that more or less like the world axis, this sense, the center of the world, which in a sense could be related to the spine. And even though he did not seem to have an understanding of the chakras from an astrological standpoint, it is interesting that there does seem to be a little correlation here. The second point on the tree is like a Sagittarian symbol of an archer, which is Jupiterian. The first level is, he didn't explain this female figure, a hooded female figure with a chalice, but it's got a Saturnian feel in terms of a hidden cloaked figure. And then we've got a serpent up here, you see. And this, by the way, this is the best illustration I could find online. You cannot see some of the details, so you'll have to take my word for some of these points, but there's a serpent that weaves around the tree. We've got a lotus here, which is a Buddhist and a Hindu symbol both, but it deals with the notion of death and resurrection, because the lotus closes down at nighttime, and then it opens up in the daytime. And it also, the other aspect of the lotus symbol, which he didn't talk about, is that part of the reason the lotus is such a profound symbol is because it's got its roots down in the mud, while the flower is above the water, that's up towards the sun. And that kind of represents, you might say, the essence of spirituality, the sense that we have our root down on the earth plane, and yet our petals are turned toward the sun. He's got the eightfold wheel of the Hindu wheel of becoming, which later became the sixfold, I believe it's sixfold Buddhist wheel. But it's flaming, interestingly, and in the very center, you can't quite see it here. I did enlarge this, by the way, a little bit. There you go. You can see it a little more clearly, but the middle there you see the yin-yang symbol, which is Taoist. And he has the four, this is very hard to see, but he's got the tetramorph, the four key creatures of the fixed sign of the zodiac. I almost have to put my glasses on. This is so hard to see, but you've got the fixed signs of, there's Aquarius, the angel. You've got, I believe this is an eagle there. I know where they are, I just can't see them clearly. There's a bull, and I believe that might be the bull. This might be the eagle. That's the angel, and there's a lion in there somewhere. We'll just have to take their word for it because I have a hard time seeing them. And then you've got a phoenix here, which again is very hard to see in this illustration that's rising up out of the ashes. Coming down, there's like a third eye up here, but it's the eye of Horus, an Egyptian symbol. Horus, the eye of Horus is a symbol to some extent of sacrifice, because Horus sacrificed his eye to go against Seth, to save his father Osiris, as I recall. But coming down is Horus. Horus is descending here while the phoenix is rising up. And here a crown on top is a symbol of supremacy. And there's a Christ-like symbolism in the figure, because you've got the wounds of Christ. You've got where the nails went in the hands and the feet. But what you can't see in this image, you've got Hebrew letters, which I'm going to get here in a minute, which are quite interesting. For the four-lettered name of God. You also have the 12 signs of the zodiac implied by 12 fruits in the tree, which you can't quite see here. So it's one of these extraordinary sort of amalgamated images that tries to convey so many different things, and I'm probably leaving something out in there. Well, there are several things I'm going to get to here shortly, but the key element of this image that I want to emphasize, if we can go back here for a second, what is the key fact? I'm curious if anyone can come up with this. What is the key element of this image? Anybody? What's the key symbolism? It's staring you right in the face. It's a star. It's a pentagram. Now, what's the significance of that? He's got the body in the shape of a pentagram. The body of Christ in the shape of a pentagram. And the pentagram has many different symbols. There's many different ways that it's been used. The golden ratio is part of it in the Pythagorean system. The orbits of Venus tie into a pentagram they carve out with the station points in the sky and all this sort of thing. But if we can go back to the pad here, I want to draw something. There's something very profound about the pentagram. It relates to a state of awakened consciousness to some extent. You take a square, for example. That doesn't represent consciousness. If anything, it represents matter. But, you add a fifth point, and suddenly there is an element of consciousness in the esoteric system to the star that is not there in the square. And the star actually has 3 levels, by the way. There's 5 elements here. There's earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The quintessence, the fifth essence, ether. That's mind, you might say. I believe I have, let's go back to the illustrations for a second here. See, the human figure, that's the Leonardo da Vinci image, and this is another example of the human figure from Renaissance symbolism. I believe this is from Agrippa, but I'm not sure. You have this curious thing about the 5 elements, but you also have, and I don't agree with this is a traditional configuration, but as I hope to show you, let's go back one more time to the pad here, Jim. Oh, we have it down there, okay. If you could, that'd be ideal.
It's not very big.
That's fine. You take the star, and there's 3 levels. You've got this level down here, which is, that's earth and water. The second level there, which is fire and air. And then you have the 3rd level, which is spirit, you might say. Spirit, astral mind, emotions, whatever you want to call it. And then you've got earth down here. The 5 elements. The bottom 2 layers are dual. There's 2 down there, there's 2 there, and there's 1 there. It's kind of a miniature expression of the entire cosmos, of spirit and the intermediary realms and then the material realms, you could say. In fact, let me just show before. I showed these 5 layers before. There's 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5-pointed star expresses those 5 layers below. We're going to come back to that shortly. So let me go on here to the next level. Whoops. Now, does anybody know what this is? This is the image referred to in some yogic traditions as Kuthastra, or Kuthasta, I should say. It's Kuthastha. In a sense, it's the 3rd eye. It's the middle of the Ajna chakra. And you find this idea, it was taught very, very prominently in the Kriya Yoga tradition, this notion that when you finally raise up in samadhi into the 3rd eye, you can take the, so that people can see me when I point to this here, you might want to take and get my image back. When you get to the 3rd eye, you see a golden ring with a blue interior and a light in the middle, but it actually is a star in the middle if you go more closely into it. This is another illustration from, I believe, SRF. I believe I have another one here. Yes, this is from another tradition. I believe it's the Dafri John Adida group, which is a little more elaborate. But the point is that this 5-pointed star Where's the arrow? Why can't I seem to get the arrow going here? You can. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay. So you've got this five-pointed star here, which represents your higher self. It represents you. It represents the five lower levels of your nature, the earth, water, air, fire, the five planes that you exist on. And in a sense, this is, the universal diagram. As some of the yogis say, you have infinite beings living in these different worlds. You're approaching yourself as you get up into the third eye and you start seeing this sort of depiction of who you really are. There's the saying in the Bible, if thine eye be single, your body will be filled with light, which is conveying much the same idea. And in a sense, you could describe that star. Oh, and by the way, yes, isn't it interesting that we have in our system the Christmas tree with a five-pointed star at the top? In a sense, that's an intuitive grasping of the chakra tree, and at the top you've got your own five-pointed star that's up there. So it represents the personal divine. It's the quintessence of who you are. It's the individualized divine, you might say. The famous or infamous, however you want to look at it, occultist magician Crowley referred to, he used to say, every man and woman is a star. This idea that you are a star, that is your true nature, your perfected nature, you might say. And in the Kabbalistic tradition, the Christian Kabbalistic tradition even more so, you have this notion that the five-pointed star in that respect is an expression of the Christ principle. The Christ principle as a potential of consciousness, the potential of your higher self, the potential of your perfected self, you might say. And if you look at this diagram, in a sense, this world tree that we're seeing here is really the burning bush. And so it's conflating Old Testament and New Testament ideas here in a very interesting way, because when Moses goes to the mountaintop, which is a metaphor, he goes to the mountaintop, which is a symbol for the notion of rising up high in meditation, going up to the mountaintop of your own nature. He confronts this fiery apparition, a burning bush that does not consume itself, and he asks what God's name is. And what does God say? I am that I am. In other words, Moses gets to the mountaintop, and what does he confront? He confronts the principle of self-conscious awareness. And it's spelled in the Hebrew system, IHVH. And you can't see it in this diagram, but those four letters are inscribed on the wounds of where Jesus was crucified. There's IHVH in those 4 points, but you'll notice something very interesting up here at the top. There's another Hebrew letter there, Shin, S-H-I-N. I believe I have something here. This is the letter. Let's go back. You can't see it too clearly, but it's there, right there. It's at that fifth point of the star. What is Shin? Shin relates to fire in the Hebrew Kabbalistic system, but it also is one of the names for God, Shaddai. It relates to Shaddai. And so what this is really saying is that you have those 4 points, and then you add Shin there to a fifth point, and it becomes, in a sense, God is brought down to earth. The way the Christian Kabbalists talk about it, this is a diagram from the Christian Kabbalistic tradition of the 4 letters of the name of God. I believe that this is I, H, V, H, and then you have Shin up there. This is the Christ principle. There's another diagram that shows this here. And by the way, I have this in here for a reason. In the Hindu, in the Kabbalistic, in the Hebrew system, the way that you show Shin is by having your hands like this. It's a greeting, you might say, a blessing from the rabbi. And that's kind of interesting how this came down to us in terms of Spock's greeting there. Now, So what is this? Adam Kadmon is something you keep coming across in the Kabbalistic and Christian Kabbalistic literature. Adam Kadmon. It's different from Adam and the Adam and Eve story. Adam Kadmon is the prototype, you might say, in the highest planes of the perfected existent. It's like the template for the enlightened possible human, and a template for all the worlds of existence, you might say, that comes down and gives rise to not only the world, but to forms that can give rise to consciousness, give rise to enlightenment. And Joffre's image, in a sense, is Adam Kadmon. It's that potential. But Adam Kadmon is both the prototype of the perfected man or woman, as well as the potential of the perfected man or woman. In other words, when you become enlightened, you awaken to your star potential, so to speak. You know, it's funny that we call people that are celebrity stars, because in a sense that's an intuition of, you know, giving off the light of our nature, although not necessarily in a particularly spiritual fashion. But this is another example of where Christ in an older engraving is related to the five-pointed star. And here's yet another example of the Christ child related to the five-pointed star. Now, let's see here. I believe Nimoy consciously chose that symbol. I wouldn't doubt it, William. I can't remember. I know that Shatner was Jewish. I wonder if Nimoy was Jewish, because that would kind of seal the deal. You're writing something, William. I'm sure you can add something. Well, I'll be darned. Isn't that interesting? So he would have to know that that was a greeting in that tradition. And whether Gene Roddenberry might have come up with that or he did, but I suspect you're right, William. That's quite interesting. Thank you. Now we really have to take this to another level, which is the way that the mystics that I've studied with talk about it. I'm going to go back here a little bit. The way they've talked about it is that when you get to this star, and by the way, I've only seen it twice. I've been meditating for eons, and I've only seen it twice, and I saw it like this, the earlier drawing. This is how I saw it. This is when you're not seeing it very clearly. And the one time was at the Zen monastery after an all-week sitting, and then the other time I saw it almost like this, and then I couldn't sustain the experience. But what Kriyananda and Shelley and Yogananda and other yogis have talked about is that when you see this star, you try to go through it. It's a doorway. And that there's perhaps even, Kriyananda spoke as though there's actually an opening in the middle of that star that pulsates, or palpitates is the way one writer put it. It opens and closes. And then you go through it. And when you go through it, that's when you step out of your personal universe, your personal spiritual universe, into God's universe. It's the doorway between you and God. There's that famous saying by Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. This is that eye, you might say, the third eye. You know, it's you go through it, and let me put it a little differently. Christ consciousness, as a Christian mystic yogi might talk about it, is the fulfillment of your own nature, your own Atman, you might say, the awakening of everything that you're about. But that is just the beginning of the process. And then you have God consciousness. The way this is sometimes shown in the Hindu system is you see lines drawn from the third eye up to the top of the head, up to the thousand-petaled lotus. And that, I remember Kriyananda, this is some 30 years ago, Kriyananda talking about how he, in an early experience of meditation, he got up to that third eye and he managed to break through. Maybe break is the wrong word, but he got through. And he said he experienced in some fashion, I don't know if he explained it as seeing or hearing or feeling, but he said there was the lineage, the Kriya lineage, including his teacher Shelley. And he said that he saw Shelley, and the phrase that he used, which I never forgot, he felt an energy coming off of Shelley, and the way he described it was, "I've never been loved like that," as though there was this extraordinary, almost superhuman love coming off of Shelley in that transcendent state. And then he said he kind of drew back. Something about the experience, he couldn't hold on to it, and he pulled back out of that state through the five-pointed star back into his own universe, shall we say. But it is entering a different universe, distinctly different from yours, and yet it is a reflection of yours. We're going to get to that in a second. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm, and vice versa. By the way, I did want to also mention, and there's another guy that, this is kind of a little bit of a risque story, I suppose, but there was a student of Kriyananda's who was a fairly well-known reggae musician, but also a really Class A mystic. I won't mention his name. He's still around. He's out east. And he had toured with the Stones and Talking Heads. He'd been a brilliant musician. Still is, actually. And he meditated a lot. He would do his Kriya Yoga techniques for hours a day. He also did other things because he was a formal Rastafarian. I'll let you fill that in with your imagination. And dreadlocks and the whole thing. It was a very interesting fellow. And I was talking to him about his chart one day and how he had some very profound aspects coming up in his horoscope. I think it was Uranus, Neptune were about to conjunct his sun. And like 3 months down the road, I spoke to him about a year later, and I said, "What happened to you then?" And he said that he did some very mind-altering substance and did meditation for like 5 or 6 hours straight. And he had never heard Kriyananda tell the story about going through the star. And he said that he went through the third eye and he started to go into another universe. It was like, he saw the third eye and he started to go through, and he realized that if he went through all the way, he'd never come back. It was that sense of the gate, paragate, whatever that is exactly, about beyond the beyond. You go and you have a choice. You can come back and be the bodhisattva, or the arhat, I think is the phrase they use. You can just keep going and never look back. And he kind of pulled back. He did not stay in that space. So I thought that was very interesting. And by the way, I had a debate with someone today who felt that the chakras are a cultural specific sort of idea. There's debate about how old the chakras are as a metaphysical system in the yoga tradition. Some say they go back thousands of years. Others say they're like 1700s, 1800s. It's not, to me, it's like saying, the elemental table, even if it is a late construction, it's still valid. Einstein's relativity is a late creation, but it's still valid. And likewise, I do believe the chakras are they're not simply a cultural specific system. I really do believe that anyone that moves up through that point will see the star. You can debate how it's going to be interpreted, but that truly is something, that is there. And even though this may be stretching it a bit, let's go a little bit ahead here to in the old Egyptian system, you have the star as a very prominent symbol. Some say it isn't a star. Some say it might mean something else. I don't think there's unanimity exactly on what it means. I've gotten 2 different opinions from 2 different Egyptologists. And it makes a difference how you interpret this as a phonetic symbol or as a pictographic symbol. But the point is, I do find it interesting. When I was in Egypt last time, and you go to the burial shrine of King Tut, and isn't this a curious image? You have this figure of a figure, and then you've got a 5-pointed star that's kind of sending down rays into the forehead of this presumably pharaonic figure. I'm not claiming this is a direct relation to the 5-pointed star of yoga. I'm saying it's an interesting coincidence at the very least. All right? Now, any questions or comments about this? All right, now, so let me back up. I'll build up to this drum roll. So we're talking here about the star is the embodiment of your personal divinity, shall we say. Your personal universe. It's the symbol of Christ consciousness, your perfected self, Adam Kadmon in the most exalted fashion. But then there is this point beyond the God principle, you might say, the God beyond, the macrocosmic God. What is the symbol for that? If the five-pointed star is a symbol for the microcosm, what's the symbol for the macrocosm? And according to the occultist I've studied with, it is the six-pointed star. And I presume that that is, to some extent, because it represents both, the upward triangle is that spirit, it's pointing up, and the downward triangle is substance and matter. And this is the interlaced triangle, which is prominent not only in alchemy, of course. It's a key symbol of the Theosophical seal. And it is also, if you go into the scholarship of the Theosophical seal, there's several places it could have been inspired by. This is from a drawing several years earlier by Eliphas Levi, who was an occultist, a French occultist. And it's quite similar. You look at this and you see, just as in the Blavatsky symbol, you see not only the six-pointed star, but you see the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own self, biting its own tail. And this relates to the microcosm, macrocosm ideal as well, the upper God, the lower God, so to speak. And so the six-pointed star, which also is related in astrology to the Grand Trine, it's related in, if you go back into the Judaic system, there are legends that King David had a shield with a six-pointed star that represented, according to one teacher I heard, it related to this configuration at the moment he was born, and to another teacher said no, when he became king of Israel there was a six-pointed star in the heavens, and so he wore this on his shield. That's probably all apocryphal, but the point is, it's part of this idea of the importance of this symbol. It's also, by the way, the six-pointed star is the symbol of the heart chakra in the yoga system, the anahata chakra, the 6 points there, which has a lot to do with the fact that the heart is the mediating point between the upper chakras and the lower chakras. Similar to Tiphereth in the Tree of Life, the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. The heart is that which marries those two realms, and there's profound symbolism in that as well. So now if we try to summarize this part of the talk, I'm talking about the microcosm on several levels. On one level, on the most superficial level, you are a microcosm of the physical universe, the way the stars and the planets are at the moment you're born. But if you see the universe itself as a symbol of higher levels, it actually is a multi-leveled symbol, similar to the way that a piece of sheet music can have different octaves, even though it's just a piece of physical sheet music in and of itself. And then you've got this very grand level of the microcosm and the macrocosm relating to the five-pointed star is the personal divine, and the six-pointed star is the transpersonal divine, the God principle. And these two are interlocking, and some people actually try to connect the pentagram and the hexagram like that in ways that seem a little bit forced to me. But thou art that in the Upanishads, the idea that you are both of those, but in a sense it's about marrying those two. There was a famous magician whose name I won't mention here, who talked about the whole point of magic is to marry the microcosm and the macrocosm, in other words, union with God. And that's the point of true higher magic, of true ritual. It's the point of meditation, bringing those things together. And well, before I go, any questions? I'm going to switch gears here. We have, we don't have to wrap up right away, do we? Because your class canceled. We had a class that was supposed to follow ours, and it got canceled. So we have a little more time. I wouldn't mind going a little longer, especially since I started late. And but if there's any questions before I move on here. or khanas. I'm going to switch to the next diagram while we're waiting. I thought while I was at it, I would talk a little bit about this very famous diagram from Robert Flood, who was an interesting metaphysician, mystic, and he came up with these extraordinary diagrams. I think it was around in the early 1600s, I believe. And we talked last week about the different levels and the great chain of being. I believe I used that term. And you look at these diagrams similar to the Jafra image we started with, and they're very confusing. It's almost impossible to make sense of them right away, but I'm going to explain this very simply because I think it's worth knowing this image because it kind of summarizes some of what we've been talking about here so far. If you break it down into its simplest essence, it becomes much more intelligible. For example, there are different levels of existence here. The great chain of being here starts with, or ends with, depending on which way you approach it. These are the physical planes here. Here's Earth down here. And then you have this ape-like figure, which represents really humanity, humans. It represents the ape of nature, the ape of God, the ape of nature. And you have I can go actually to the next image here, which is a slightly larger version. You can see it a little better there. And so the physical plane, physical existence is broken down to animal, vegetable, mineral, and so on and so forth. And there's all of these different factors in here, which I frankly don't understand. Then you have the next level, which is, you see the planetary symbols here. Well, those right there, those are not planetary, but then you've got Mercury, Venus, Sun, I think that's Mars, etc. And then you've got the starry realm here. So this is what would maybe be equivalent to the astral planes in here. And let's go back to the earlier image so we can see this. So in other words, this is the physical, the material planes here. This is like you might say the astral planes, the lower astral. Then you've got the angelic, the celestial planes. There's actually a starry firmament level in here. And then you've got the angelic planes with angels, and this is very interesting the way it shows. For example, the innermost angels have bodies with wings, and then you've got just faces of angels with wings, showing angels that are not involved with the affairs of humanity at all. And then you've got the four-letter name of God here, IHVH, which we're going to go into in a later class, the four parts of consciousness. I am aware that I am. And you have a chain going down there to the female, which is the feminine, Anima Mundi, the Sophia, Shekinah. The female relates to the creation, shall we say. And then the chain goes from her hand down to the human ape down there, shall we say. And so that relates to this idea that nothing can happen that does not begin up here in the God point. The chain, that's the point of the chain. It's like a precipitory descent that goes down. And like I said, you might relate this back to Shelley's idea, to that notion of the cosmic dream. And we've fallen from the higher realms, whether you want to see that as the higher astral there or the really higher astral, the nous, the celestial realm, and then dropped down bit by bit. Okay? So, let's talk a little bit about reincarnation and karma here, unless anyone has any questions, because I wanted to cover this last week and we did not have time. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here. We'll come back to this in a second. You know, it's as I said last week, one of the points that Kriyananda and Shelley reiterated all the time was that we haven't just had 10 or 20 lifetimes. We've had thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of lifetimes, not necessarily all on Earth, possibly on other planets, other solar systems, on other planes. And there are patterns that arise over multiple lifetimes, and it's almost as though, well, there's three kinds of karma, you might say, that apply in this round of rebirth. There's the karmas from the past. There's the karmas, your own karmas. There's group karmas because you're tied up in group karmas, although Kriya Yoga was adamant about the point that there really is no group karma. There's individuals who come together with similar karma, which is an interesting way to think about it. But there's the karmas that you're creating for the future. And then there's something that you really can't call it karma. It has more to do with the principle of telos, of purpose, the idea that an acorn has a telos because it's going to become an oak tree at some point. And so you can look at an acorn from the standpoint of the forces that came together to create the acorn, forces and minerals and ingredients from the past. But you could also see the acorn in terms of the potential that it is moving towards. And in the same way, your own individual life has past karmas propelling it, as well as seed potentials that are drawing it forward into the future, into your fullest potential, into that star, to become that star. And Shelley used to say that when you enter into God's dream, because you're entering into his memory banks and taking on forms within his memory banks, her memory banks, however you want to look at that, that every path in God's dream eventually leads to God himself because they're his memories. So that it's inevitable that you're going to wind up at some point enlightened. It's inevitable that you're going to get to that point of God realization. You can't run away from it. There's a phrase, they talk about this in Buddhism as well, this notion of enlightenment is inevitable in a certain sense. But the reason I brought up this painting was when I was 19, I went through Europe and I looked at different museums. I was going to the Art Institute and I wanted to see the great masters. And I went to this Dutch museum to see this famous painting by Rembrandt called Night Watch. And as I went up, I remember going up and looking at the painting up close and seeing the way that he almost impressionistically brought together the colors and the images. It was almost like the first impressionist. Because up close you see these dabs of color that have no meaning whatsoever. And some of them, by and large, the bulk of this painting is kind of drab colors. And when you step back is when you really see it all come together. And it dawned on me later on when I was studying with Shelley and Kriya Yoga, this painting stuck in my mind for some reason. And it dawned on me when I heard Shelley talk about the fact that you really can't understand the purpose of a given lifetime. No matter how good or bad it might seem in the short run, you really have to see it in the larger picture. And even Dora Kuhns, one of the former presidents of the Theosophical Society, she made this comment once. She said, the higher self perceives in terms of eons, while the lower ego perceives in terms of 60, 70, 80 years. The higher self does not see the drama of a lifetime in terms of some short span of time. It sees it in terms of millions, if not billions, if not trillions of years. Another way to think of this maybe is a film strip. You look at a 3-hour film, you may go see something like Avatar or Gone with the Wind, whatever it is. And that film, 24 frames a second, 3 hours, that's roughly 250,000 frames of film. You can't judge that film on one frame. You can't judge an entirety of existence within the dream of God, so to speak, by one life, let alone by one bad year or one bad week in that life. And when I looked at this painting and I thought about back to this painting and how you go up close and you see these individual dabs of color that look really quite homely up close. And then you step back and it comes together and there's this magical quality to it. And I was talking to a client. The reason this came up for me when it did was I was talking to a client that was suicidal. This was about 20 years ago. She was saying to me that her life was just nothing at all. She felt like her life had been wasted. What's the purpose? And she had studied yoga and she had studied these metaphysical ideas and just couldn't quite understand how it applied to her. And I used the example of this painting. I talked about, what might seem to be a drab lifetime. She felt the main thing she said, it was very tragic in a way because it wasn't that she had great disasters in her life. It's that she was bored with her life. She felt that she was working a boring job. She had a boring marriage. She didn't do anything interesting, and she thought that her life was really going nowhere. And I used the example of this painting that you can't necessarily judge the role of this lifetime in terms of the small picture. You sometimes have to step back because we don't know what role this is playing in terms of millions of years, billions of years. I have a relative that actually served time in prison because of some bad habits, some bad drug habits, to be honest. Spent several years in prison. And again, he was questioning what purpose does this possibly have? It's very hard to say, but let's go back and talk about some of these past life possibilities. Well, there's no way to prove who was who in a past life, but Kriyananda felt that he used to say on several occasions, he said Abraham Lincoln came back as Mahatma Gandhi. They were both lawyers that were crusading for civil rights, and they wound up getting assassinated in the process. There is some similarity, especially in the nose. They obviously have different facial hair, to put it mildly. Their ears are quite similar, their nose are similar. There's no way to prove it, but it's an interesting idea that the one man he was so involved in civil rights, and then in the next lifetime wound up getting involved in rights in a different sort of fashion. But now let's go to an interesting other case here. Kriyananda in private, never in public. Maybe I shouldn't even talk about this. Forgive me, Kriyananda. But in private, he used to he would hint at past lives. And he would never talk about any glorious past lives in terms of, he was Jesus. I've actually known at least 2 guru types who claim they were Jesus in their past life. And I'm thinking Jesus must have been pretty crowded, in that personality, because a lot of people have said that they were either Jesus Christ or Cleopatra or Marie Antoinette. I don't buy the multiple soul thing, by the way, that you have multiple souls inhabiting the same person. Not in that sense, anyway. But Kriyananda said in private, he kept talking about Mexico in his lectures, which I thought was interesting. He would talk about beloved Mexico. And then in a couple of times in private conversation, he mentioned that he was Pancho Villa, okay? And I thought, what? How is that possible? Pancho Villa. And I thought, which is interesting because Kriyananda had a stellium in Aries. And Pancho Villa died in 1917, I believe, and Kriyananda was born in 1927 in that ballpark. And which I thought was curious too, because Yogananda claimed that he was William the Conqueror in a past lifetime. Notice that these great yogis are not picking exalted saintly figures. They're picking people that actually were not the greatest human beings in some ways, in terms of having been involved with murdering people and all this. And actually, my personal feeling about that is that there's a lot more of the warrior in the guru, and there's a lot more of the guru in the warrior. Think of Patton, for example, going and talking about his past lives when he would, if you ever saw the movie Patton by the screenplay by Coppola, where he remembered past lives. And generals and gurus, I think, are one step apart, because sometimes great gurus have to be generals in terms of marshaling a force of people. And Yogananda came to the States. He established a beachhead, you might say. And Kriyananda, now you look at these two faces back to back, and it's quite interesting. You put a beard on Pancho Villa, look at the eyes. They're quite similar. I'm not saying this is proof of anything. I'm saying it's interesting to me. And Kriyananda did have that stellium in Aries, which I thought was interesting. He had a sun in Taurus leading a stellium in Aries. And he had a warrior side, but I think he needed one for what he did. He was a great teacher, but he was trying to establish a teaching in an area and a time that was not at all sympathetic to teachings of that sort. He fought quite a battle in a different sense. But I also think, the argument that comes up a lot in talk about reincarnation is why does everybody always say they were someone famous? Well, not everybody does say that, but when you're talking about notable figures, people that are in the public eye, it's more likely, I think, that they have been in the public eye in the past. So I don't see that as necessarily an argument in itself against reincarnation. Now, here's another interesting example I want to talk about. This is a writer named Stephen Mitchell. He wrote a book called Cloud Atlas that the Wachowskis made into a film last year. And I read the book. Now, when I was studying, Joseph Campbell used to come through town, and I went to a lot of his lectures and workshops. I talked to him on a number of occasions. And he turned me on to James Joyce. I found Joyce virtually unintelligible before I studied with Campbell. And after I studied with Campbell, he was still unintelligible, but at least I could respect the unintelligibility of it because Campbell brought out the genius of what Joyce was doing, and at least I could understand his early writings like Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And one of the things that struck me about that book was it was multi-genre. It had different styles of writing from different eras to reflect different ages in this artist's life, as I recall. And the writing was gorgeous. And when I read Cloud Atlas by Stephen Mitchell, I thought to myself, this reminds me of James Joyce. The writing is extraordinary. And it's multi-genre. He writes, in the book, he writes all these different chapters in different styles at different eras. And I think this man is a true genius, that he can do this. And he's Irish. And so I thought, I'm going to look up a photograph of Stephen Mitchell because I didn't know what he looked like, and I want to compare it to a photo of James Joyce just for the heck of it and see if there's any similarity between the two. So now I called up a photo of James Joyce, and then I put them side by side, and then somebody I know, just as an unsolicited favor, took the picture of Stephen Mitchell and put a cap and glasses and a mustache on him like James Joyce. And this isn't proof of anything, but it's awfully interesting to me that when I read Stephen Mitchell's book, I said this, and he's Irish like James Joyce is, lives in Ireland. And you see these sorts of patterns, and it may in fact be that he wasn't the reincarnation, but I think you can plug in to certain archetypes through history. Jean Houston years ago talked about this, how she had all these synchronicities come up that indicated some connection to the philosopher Proclus, Proclus, C-L-U-S. And she, I think, concluded that it wasn't that she necessarily was Proclus, but that maybe she was plugged into that archetype, into that stream of consciousness that Proclus had plugged into. Now, any questions or comments on that?
It's not necessary to look alike.
The question that came up here is, it's not necessary to look the same. No, but I mentioned after class to someone here how Kriya made an interesting comment once where he said because he was working with a disciple about some very distant past life experience they had had. It might have been a trauma, I presume. He went back in terms of the Akashic records or into their past lives, and he went way back, I think like hundreds of lives, and he said there was surprisingly little difference in their personality and appearance over many, many lifetimes. And I don't think you have to look the same, but my understanding is there is some kind of similarity. The examples of reincarnation that have come up in the popular literature where you see a picture of someone that says that they were such and such in the past, or they do research like Ian Stevenson's work, the reincarnation fellow from the University of Virginia, when they are able to get photographs of people before and after, there is quite a similarity. I don't think that's always true, but I think it's true in a lot of cases. Or you take like the case of Lincoln and Gandhi. If indeed they were the same person, there's quite a bit of difference there on the surface, but when you look at the features, if you were to put a beard on Gandhi and and hair on his head, I think that they would look quite similar. So yeah, I think it's an open question. Got another few got another minute or two here before we wrap this up. One other point. Someone asked Kriyananda once the question, why don't we remember our past lives? And he had an interesting answer. He said, we do. We remember them emotionally. Your emotional patterns reflect the past lives in terms of your fears, your hopes, your wishes, your inclinations, your habits. So even if you don't remember the details, or you may remember them too in terms of the things you're drawn towards, the unresolved issues. There's lots of ways in which you can remember it. William, let's see what you said on Joyce. Check out Anthony Burgess' abridged version of Finnegan's Wake. It helps and it's shorter. Actually, I wasn't aware of Burgess's abridged version, but Campbell mentioned that he wrote a book that was like a beginner's guide to Finnegan's Wake. I forget what it's called, but if you looked on Google, Amazon under Joseph Campbell, you'd find a, I forget what it's called, but he did like an explanation of Finnegan's Wake for people that I glanced through it. It was quite good. But I'll look that up in Anthony Burgess, because Finnegan's Wake, one of the things I talked to Campbell about in private was when I was doing my research into synchronicity. And it seemed to me that the book Ulysses expressed a synchronistic worldview because of the way things dovetailed and interconnected in a really interesting way. And I asked him if he felt that Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake reflected a synchronistic worldview, of a synchronistic view of everyday life. And Campbell said, Ulysses, yes, but not Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is totally in the dream world. It's off into the astral, so to speak. It has very little bearing on the physical. It's you've crossed over the river Styx, you might say, into the nether regions. So, but and you say, Jim, a skeleton key to finger. Thank you. That's it. 1944. All right. Thank you. But the one other point I was going to make here about remembering past lives, and that is that we bury things even from our own life emotionally, so why would we not forget things from the past? And the example that either Kriyananda or Shelley used once to convey this, it was a Zen story about a village in China wanted to send someone from the village to study with this great teacher off in the mountains. And they were allowed, for whatever ceremonial reasons, to pick one person from the village, and they picked what they thought was the purest, holiest young man from the village. And they sent him off to this teacher to study. And the teacher said, "Are you willing to study with me?" And the student said, "Yes." And the teacher said, "Well, then you have to agree to everything I tell you to do." And the student said, "Okay." And the teacher said, "Are you sure?" And the student said, "Yes." And the teacher said, "Okay, what I want you to do is go off and join the military for a year." And the student was staggered by this. It's not what he expected. And he put up a hissy fit at first, but then he finally relented because he realized he agreed to do it. He went off and fought in a war with the Chinese military. And he came back, and the teacher said to him, "Well, how was it?" And the student said, "It was awful, terrible experience, I just awful." And the teacher says, "Okay, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to re-enlist and go back and be in the military for another year." And the student was absolutely just stupefied by this, but he had to agree. So and his village was counting on him as well. So he went off into the military and he fought in another war, maybe another few wars, and he came back and the teacher said, "Okay, I want to know, how was it?" And the student said, "It was awful. It was bloodshed, there was killing, it was the worst thing ever." And the teacher says, "Okay, well, I want you to go back and re-enlist one more time." And the student couldn't believe this. And now he's getting fed up, but he's got to do it. Like I said, his village is counting on him. He couldn't go back in shame. He goes back and fights in another few battles, and he comes back, and the teacher says, "Okay, how was it?" And the student says, "Oh, you should have been there. It was great. We kicked their asses. It was just, we won. It was fantastic. And the teacher said, oh, now you're ready to study. The point being that the teacher saw in the student these buried impulses, these buried seeds, you might say. And he could not work with the student until the student became aware of those proclivities, those tendencies, those karmic tendencies. And so in a sense, he had to draw them out the hard way. And once the student was aware of those, they could be either transmuted or dissolved. There might be ways that you could use those in some positive fashion. And I have in my own life, and maybe some of you have as well, had things come up where you think, where did that come from? Some emotion that you didn't think you were capable of, and you think, boy, there's something primal about that. And I think that ties into this idea. We don't remember a lot. We certainly don't remember our birth. So why would we, most of us don't, why would we remember things from our past life necessarily? So I want to wrap it up on that note, but let me just see, I have an image here, I believe, no, that's the last image. Next week we're going to talk about some of the more practical techniques in terms of what is this so-called enlightenment? What are the techniques that teachers use? What does enlightenment mean, and how do we get there? And so we're going to go into that next week. We're going to touch on that in actually the next few weeks, but next week we're going to lay the foundation for that. And if there's any other questions, I don't see anyone writing anything, so I think that's it for tonight.
Will we be enlightened by the end of the
Yes, I do get all your money back. You will be enlightened by the end of this 6 weeks, yes. Money back guarantee. Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. See you next week. Namaste.